Where it all began. The origins of the world according to Norse mythology. Before we begin to narrate the origins of Norse mythology, we must clarify that it is not a religion transmitted by a higher entity as happened in Christianity but is the fruit of the hand of man. More precisely, these myths came from the first of some Christian monks who managed to save the legends from inevitable oblivion thanks to their demanding work as copyists. The traditional religion of the Nordic peoples before they were Christianized, in fact, was transmitted orally. The long and detailed tales could hardly be engraved on stone and, for this reason, most of the mythology has been lost. Thanks to some Christian religions such as Snorri Sturluson and Saxo Grammaticus, more or less substantial parts have been recovered that have been preserved to this day. The first monk mentioned is the author of the Prose Edda, a manual for aspiring poets that, in addition to containing some of Snorri's compositions, also includes many legends concerning the already Norse mythology, such as Gylfa's Deception, which narrates the adventures of Odin disguised as a wayfarer, and discourses on poetry that sees dialogue between the sea god Aegir and Bragi, the god of poetry. The book was composed around 1220 in the middle of the Christian era, but, despite this, the writer managed to draw on pagan sources without contaminating the work with the religious heritage of his people. Although some modern critics blame Snorri for having strongly adapted the myths he had decided to pass on by modifying them so as not to affect his Christian morality, the majority of mythologists consider the author's approach very reassuring, also because the sources from which he drew are undoubtedly older and even more than those that have come down to us through the Poetic Edda. The latter, in fact, is a collection of poems in Old Norse taken from the Codex Regius, an Icelandic manuscript whose origins are not known, except that it had been found by a bishop in the southwest of the Norse island. Anyway, the Poetic Edda begins with the famous prophecy of the seer, an old witch who narrates Nordic cosmology and foresees the final battle, the Ragnarok. The collection follows with a series of myths, including moral foundations of Odin called Hovmal, and the quarrel of Loki that sees the god go to a party and reveal an endless series of scandals committed by the other deities, probably for indirectly denounce immoral behavior such as adultery. Then follow the events of the Nibelungen set in the years of migration, around the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The image that is obtained from the reading of the poems Eddaci or the Prose Edda deviates from the common iconography. The gods are not powers of nature, but multifaceted characters with merits, defects, and sins, just like us humans. In addition, we must not imagine them as opposed to giants, since sometimes they descend from them or mate with them. For this, they are considered equal. The attribution of a specific character to each deity is a peculiarity only ours, that we need to find the good and the bad of history at any cost. This dichotomy and the marked characterization of the characters, in fact, do not exist in Norse mythology. After this long premise, we can explain the origins of Norse mythology. First of all, as you may have guessed from the adjective Norse, we are in Northern Europe among the Vikings originating in Scandinavia, Denmark, and northern Germany who, thanks to their strong navigation skills, colonized the Orkney Islands, Shetland, the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and Newfoundland, present-day Canada. The frequent raids of the Vikings were due both to their thirst for blood, but also to the need to expand their territories in search of new resources that, unfortunately, were difficult to find in their homelands. As much as they may seem barbaric and sanguinary, the Vikings were also a cultured people, with a strong adventurous, artisan, and artistic spirit, linked above all to navigation. In fact, their seafaring wisdom, in addition to influencing shipbuilding for centuries, pushed them east to the interior of today's Russia, south to Byzantium, and west to America 500 years before Christopher Columbus. The consideration that the Vikings had of men was based on the courage they showed in the face of death. Little was the case whether it was an enemy or a friend. This respect they had for the daredevils who were going to meet their destiny is also transmitted in Norse mythology, as we will see in the prediction of the seer when all the gods will courageously meet their destiny. European cultural impulses came to the Vikings only after a long time, when the Nordics had already developed numerous settlements and trades. At a time when Christianity spread like wildfire in Scandinavia, most of the peoples of Europe were forced to convert to this religion in order to survive. The treatment of pagans, in fact, consisted of bloody persecutions that involved the destruction of temples, idols, and the killing of all followers. Some people managed to bring themselves to safety by fleeing to Iceland, a land that did not have a king at its head, but even their paganism was soon forgotten, also because, as we have seen, the cult was transmitted orally. After a brief period of resilience, Denmark and Sweden also ended up bowing to Christianity. Soon there was no trace of the Nordic religion, apart from the two medieval texts which we quoted at the beginning of the section and which were compiled following the introduction of Christianity.